The rain came down in torrents as Evelyn squinted through the foggy windshield. The rhythmic thud of the wipers provided a steady, almost hypnotic beat as they sliced through the sheets of rain. The GPS had been insisting for the last 10 minutes that they were close, but all she could see were shadows of trees looming on either side of the narrow road. "Mom, are we there yet?" came the tired voice of her daughter, Lily, from the back seat. "Almost, sweetie," Evelyn replied, trying to sound cheerful despite the exhaustion weighing down her voice. She glanced at her husband, David, who was gripping the steering wheel a bit too tightly. His face was tense, illuminated only by the dim light of the dashboard. The house was a last-ditch attempt to escape the financial pressures that had been closing in on them over the past year. Losing David's job had been a blow, and the mounting bills left them teetering on the edge. When Evelyn received the letter notifying her that a distant great-uncle, someone she had barely known, had passed away and left her this property, it felt like a miracle. Sure, the house was far from town, practically isolated in the middle of nowhere, but they needed a fresh start. As they turned the final corner, the trees suddenly opened up to reveal a clearing. There it stood, the house. The old mansion loomed before them, its dark silhouette barely visible against the stormy sky. It was far larger than Evelyn had imagined, with multiple stories, turrets, and an elaborate facade that must have been magnificent decades ago. Now, however, it seemed to sag under the weight of its years, the paint peeling and the windows dark, like sunken eyes watching them approach. David parked the car in what appeared to be the remnants of a cobblestone driveway. The rain had turned it into a muddy mess, and they had to navigate puddles as they rushed to unload their belongings. Lily clutched her stuffed rabbit, Mr. Floppy, to her chest as she looked up at the house with wide eyes. "It's big," she whispered. "Yeah, it is," Evelyn said, forcing a smile. "Big and, well, it just needs a little love." As they reached the front door, Evelyn fumbled for the old brass key the lawyer had sent her. It was heavy and ornate, almost medieval, and it turned in the lock with a satisfying clunk. The door creaked open, revealing a dark foyer lined with dusty wooden floors. The air inside was stale and cold, carrying the faint scent of mildew and something else Evelyn couldn't quite place. "Home sweet home," David muttered under his breath, his voice thick with sarcasm. The entryway opened up to a grand staircase that seemed to spiral endlessly upward, its banisters thick with dust. Old chandeliers hung precariously from the ceiling, cobwebs draping them like ghostly veils. The dim light from their flashlights barely penetrated the shadows clinging to the corners. "Let's get these bags in and find the generator," David said, trying to sound upbeat. The electricity hadn't been turned on yet, and with the storm raging outside, it looked like they would be spending their first night by candlelight. As they ventured deeper into the house, Lily clung to Evelyn's side, her little hand clammy with nerves. The place was far from welcoming. Paintings of grim-faced ancestors lined the walls, their eyes seeming to follow them as they passed. Evelyn couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched, but she chalked it up to her nerves. They finally found the kitchen, which was surprisingly spacious but completely outdated. David set up the small gas-powered generator they had brought along, and soon a few lamps flickered to life, casting a warm glow in the otherwise darkened house. They ate a quick dinner of sandwiches, huddled around the table as the wind howled outside. "Let's get some sleep," David suggested, stifling a yawn. "We'll explore more tomorrow." Lily was reluctant to sleep in her new room alone, so Evelyn agreed to stay with her until she drifted off. She tucked her daughter into a bed that had been left behind by the previous occupants, its frame creaking under the slightest movement. Evelyn read Lily's favorite story until her eyelids fluttered shut, then gently kissed her on the forehead. As she made her way back to the master bedroom, Evelyn paused in the hallway. For a moment she thought she heard something, a faint drip, 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 coming from somewhere deep within the house. She strained her ears, trying to pinpoint its source, but the sound faded into the constant patter of the rain against the windows. Shaking off a chill, she joined David, who was already snoring softly, exhausted from the long day. She lay down beside him, the old mattress sagging beneath their weight. Sleep came quickly, but it was restless. In the early hours of the morning, Evelyn awoke with a start. The house was eerily silent now, the rain having ceased. But the sound was back, that maddening dripping, slow and steady, echoing somewhere in the darkness. She slid out of bed, careful not to wake David, and grabbed a flashlight from her nightstand. As she opened the bedroom door, she froze. There, in the dim beam of her flashlight, were wet footprints leading from the hallway, directly to her bedroom door. They stopped just outside. With her heart pounding in her chest, Evelyn took a shaky step forward. The air was colder now, and she could see her breath misting in the flashlight's beam. The footprints seemed to disappear into the darkness behind her, leading back into the depths of the house. Steeling herself, Evelyn whispered, "Hello? Is someone there?" Only silence answered, accompanied by the relentless drip, drip, drip. The house seemed to breathe around her, its ancient walls groaning as if they were alive. Evelyn's heart was pounding in her chest as she stared at the wet footprints. The air around her felt thick, almost suffocating. For a moment, she questioned if this was all just exhaustion playing tricks on her mind. She blinked hard, rubbed her eyes, and looked again. The footprints were still there, glistening faintly in the dim light of her flashlight. Gathering her courage, she followed the trail back down the hall, every step sending chills crawling up her spine. The wooden floorboards creaked beneath her feet, their groans echoing through the silent house. The trail of wet prints led her past the dusty portraits hanging on the walls, each one more unsettling than the last. The faces in the paintings seemed to leer at her, their eyes gleaming as if they knew something she didn't. The footprints ended abruptly at the door to the basement, which was slightly ajar now. She was certain she had closed it earlier. As she approached, the faint smell of damp earth and rot wafted up from below. The dripping sound was louder here, like water slowly filling a basin. The darkness beyond the basement door seemed to swallow her flashlight's beam, revealing nothing but a yawning black void. "Maybe it's just a leaky pipe," Evelyn whispered to herself, trying to calm her racing heart. The old house was bound to have plumbing issues, right? But something deep inside her protested. There was something off, something that made her skin crawl. Still, she wasn't ready to face whatever might be lurking in the darkness of the basement. Not tonight. She closed the door firmly and made her way back to the bedroom, trying to shake off the feeling of being watched. As she crawled into bed beside David, she found herself straining her ears for the sound of the dripping, but it had gone completely silent. She lay awake for hours, staring at the ceiling, waiting for the sound to return. It didn't. Eventually, exhaustion won out, and she slipped into a fitful sleep. The next morning, the storm had passed, leaving behind a mist that clung to the ground outside like a shroud. Sunlight filtered weakly through the dirty windows as Evelyn dragged herself out of bed. David was already up, rummaging through the kitchen in search of coffee. "Hey, you look like you didn't sleep a wink," he said, raising an eyebrow. "What's up?" Evelyn hesitated. She didn't want to worry him, especially not on their first full day in the new house. "Just adjusting, I guess. This place is a little creepy, isn't it?" David laughed, though it sounded forced. "Yeah, it's a fixer-upper, all right. But hey, we got it for a steal. Once we clean it up, it'll feel more like home." He leaned in to kiss her on the forehead, but she couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. As they ate breakfast, Lily joined them, dragging her feet sleepily across the floor. Her eyes were red-rimmed, and she looked even more exhausted than Evelyn. "Rough night, kiddo?" David asked, pouring her a glass of orange juice. Lily nodded slowly, her eyes downcast. I heard someone whispering," she said, her voice barely audible. Evelyn's heart skipped a beat. "What do you mean, sweetie? Whispering where?" "In my room," Lily whispered. "There was a man's voice. He kept saying my name, over and over. I told him to go away, but he wouldn't stop." She gripped Mr. Floppy tighter, her knuckles turning white. David and Evelyn exchanged uneasy glances. "It was probably just the wind, honey," Evelyn said, trying to sound reassuring. "Old houses like this can make a lot of strange noises." But Lily shook her head violently. "No, it wasn't the wind. He was right by my bed." Tears welled up in her eyes, and Evelyn pulled her daughter into a comforting embrace, but inside she was trembling. The rest of the day was spent unpacking boxes and exploring the house, trying to distract themselves from the unsettling events of the previous night. Evelyn tried to dismiss her fears as paranoia, but every creak of the floorboards, every gust of wind rattling the windows, sent her nerves on edge. While sorting through old furniture in the attic, she came across a dusty old photo album tucked away in a wooden chest. The photos were faded, sepia-toned, and showed various families who had lived in the house over the decades. But something about the faces in the photos was disturbing. They all looked strangely hollow, as if they were masking a terrible secret behind their smiles. As she flipped through the pages, she noticed something odd. In every family photo, there was a shadowy figure in the background, standing just outside the frame of focus. It was never fully visible, but the shape was unmistakable, tall, thin, with long, outstretched arms. Evelyn's breath caught in her throat. It was like the figure was watching, always lurking, just out of sight. Feeling a cold shiver run down her spine, she slammed the album shut and placed it back in the chest. The attic suddenly felt oppressively hot, the air heavy and thick. She hurried back downstairs to rejoin David and Lily. That night, after they put Lily to bed, Evelyn and David sat together in the dimly lit living room, the flickering light of the fireplace casting shadows that danced on the walls. Evelyn told David about the footprints and the dripping sound from the night before, hoping he would brush it off and reassure her. But as she spoke, she could see his face grow serious. "Maybe we should get someone to check the plumbing," David suggested, though his voice was tight. "And maybe get the locks checked too, just to be safe." The unease in his voice made Evelyn's anxiety spike. It was one thing to convince herself that it was all in her head, but if David was worried too, maybe there was something more to it. That night, the dripping sound returned, louder this time. It woke Evelyn from a deep sleep, dragging her back into the suffocating darkness of the old house. She tried to ignore it, pulling the covers over her head, but it was no use. This time, it was accompanied by something else, a whisper, barely audible, just outside her bedroom door. Evelyn, her heart froze. That was her name. She clutched David's arm, shaking him awake. "Did you hear that?" she whispered, her voice trembling. "What?" he mumbled groggily. Before she could answer, the whisper came again, clearer now, like someone was standing right outside their door. "Evelyn, I'm here." David shot up in bed, fully awake now. He reached for the flashlight on the nightstand, but before he could switch it on, the whispering stopped, plunging the room into an eerie silence. Evelyn held her breath, straining to listen, but all she could hear was her own heart thudding in her chest. For a moment, she thought it was over. But then, from somewhere deep within the house, the dripping resumed, louder and more insistent. Drip! And this time, it was joined by a slow, dragging sound, like something heavy being pulled across the floor below them. David and Evelyn exchanged terrified glances. Whatever was happening in this house, it was just beginning, and it was coming closer. The morning sun did little to ease the tension that hung in the air. Evelyn and David moved through the house like ghosts, their eyes bloodshot from another sleepless night. Lily, usually a bundle of energy, sat at the breakfast table picking at her food, her face pale and drawn. Mr. Floppy, her stuffed rabbit, was clutched tightly in her arms, as if it could somehow protect her from the horrors that had begun to seep into their lives. David cleared his throat, trying to break the uncomfortable silence. "I think we should check out the basement today," he said, not meeting Evelyn's eyes. "That dripping sound, it's probably a burst pipe or something. If we don't fix it soon, it could cause serious damage." Evelyn nodded, though a cold dread twisted in her stomach. She had been dreading the basement since the strange sounds and wet footprints started appearing. The thought of venturing into the darkness below made her skin crawl, but they couldn't avoid it forever. After breakfast, David grabbed a set of tools, and together they made their way to the basement door. Lily stayed behind in the living room, watching cartoons at a volume loud enough to drown out the whispers that seemed to haunt every corner of the house. As they approached the basement door, Evelyn's breath hitched. The door that had been slightly ajar the night before was now firmly shut, its brass handle cold to the touch. Evelyn glanced at David, who gave her a reassuring nod, though the tension in his jaw betrayed his unease. He reached for the handle, and with a creak that seemed to echo through the entire house, the door slowly swung open. A rush of damp, frigid air greeted them, carrying with it the smell of wet earth and something far more unpleasant, an odor that reminded Evelyn of decaying leaves, or perhaps something worse. She shuddered involuntarily as David flicked on his flashlight and began the descent into darkness. The wooden steps creaked ominously under their weight, each groan sounding like a warning. As they descended, the air grew colder, and the beam of David's flashlight barely seemed to penetrate the thick shadows. The dripping sound that had haunted them the past 2 nights was louder now, echoing off the stone walls like a sinister heartbeat. The basement was enormous, much larger than Evelyn had anticipated. The stone walls were slick with moisture, and the ceiling was covered in a web of old, rusted pipes. As they reached the bottom of the stairs, Evelyn's eyes were drawn to a series of strange symbols carved into the walls, twisted shapes that looked like they were part of some ancient language. "What the hell is that?" David muttered, shining his flashlight over the carvings. Evelyn couldn't answer. She could only stare at the symbols, her mind racing. They looked old, impossibly old, like something out of a forgotten era. But the thing that caught their attention the most was a large iron door at the far end of the basement. It was heavily padlocked, the metal rusted with age. The door looked entirely out of place, like it belonged in a medieval dungeon rather than the basement of a Victorian mansion. David tried to pull the door open, but the padlock held firm. He gave it a frustrated shake. "Weird. Why would anyone lock a door down here like this?" he muttered, more to himself than to Evelyn. As they stood in front of the locked door, the dripping sound suddenly stopped. The silence that followed was so intense, it felt as though the house itself was holding its breath. Evelyn's pulse quickened, and she could feel the tiny hairs on the back of her neck standing up. "Maybe we should leave it alone," she whispered, her voice barely audible. There was something about that door that felt inherently wrong, like it was holding back something that should never see the light of day. David, however, was determined. "If there's a leak behind this door, we need to fix it," he insisted. "We can't afford to let the house get damaged." Evelyn reluctantly agreed, but her eyes remained locked on the iron door. There was something dark and malevolent about it, a sense that it was guarding a secret better left undiscovered. They spent the next few hours searching the house for a tool that might break the padlock. David eventually found an old crowbar in the shed behind the house. As they returned to the basement, the daylight filtering through the small, grimy windows above had already started to fade, plunging the basement into an even deeper gloom. As David wedged the crowbar into the rusted padlock, a strange sensation washed over Evelyn, a sudden, inexplicable feeling that they were not alone. The air seemed to pulse with an unseen energy, and the hair on her arms stood up. She turned around, shining her flashlight into the shadows, half expecting to see someone or something lurking there. But there was nothing, only darkness. The padlock finally gave way with a loud snap, the sound reverberating through the basement like a gunshot. Evelyn flinched, her nerves frayed to their breaking point. David shot her a quick grin, trying to lighten the mood, but it came off as more of a grimace. "Let's see what's behind door number 1, he said, pushing the heavy iron door open with a grunt. A blast of cold air hit them, and the smell of damp earth intensified. Inside, the room beyond was pitch black, the beam of David's flashlight revealing nothing but a stone floor covered in dust and grime. But as they stepped inside, Evelyn noticed something glinting on the ground, small, wet patches that looked suspiciously like footprints. "Do you see that?" she whispered, pointing. David nodded, his face tightening with concern. The footprints were small, almost child-sized, and they seemed to lead deeper into the darkness of the room. They followed the trail, the sound of their breathing, the only noise in the oppressive silence. At the far end of the room, they found a crude stone well, its edges crumbling with age. The dripping sound was louder here, echoing up from the black depths below. David leaned over cautiously, shining his flashlight into the well, but the light couldn't penetrate the darkness beyond a few feet. "That's strange. It doesn't look like it's filled with water," David murmured. As they stood there staring into the abyss, a low whisper began to emanate from the well. It was faint at first, barely discernible, but it grew louder with each passing second. The words were unintelligible, like someone speaking in a language they couldn't understand. Evelyn's skin prickled and she grabbed David's arm. "We need to go, now." But just as they turned to leave, the whispering stopped abruptly, replaced by a soft, childlike giggle that echoed up from the depths of the well. Evelyn froze, her blood running cold. That laugh, it sounded like Lily. David and Evelyn exchanged horrified glances. Without another word, they rushed back up the stairs, slamming the basement door behind them. They could still hear that faint giggle, echoing from somewhere deep beneath the house, even as they bolted the door shut. Breathless and panicked, Evelyn whispered, That sounded like her, like Lily." David was pale, his eyes wide with shock. But Lily was upstairs. She couldn't have... Before he could finish, a loud crash came from the living room, followed by the unmistakable sound of Lily screaming. Dropping everything, they sprinted toward the sound, their hearts pounding. As they burst into the room, they found Lily standing in the center, trembling, with tears streaming down her face. "Mommy, Daddy, he's here," she sobbed, pointing toward the darkened hallway behind her. "He's here, and he wants me to go with him." But when Evelyn and David turned to look, all they saw was the empty, yawning darkness of the hallway, and the faint, wet footprints that sense. After calming Lily down and checking the house for any sign of intruders, David and Evelyn were left with more questions than answers. Despite their exhaustive search, they found no one, no evidence of anyone else having been in the house. Yet, the wet footprints leading down the hall were still there, fading slowly into the old wooden floors as if they had never existed. David tried to reassure Evelyn, but she could see the unease in his eyes. They both knew something was terribly wrong. The events of the past few days had shaken them both, but seeing Lily so frightened, terrified to the point of tears, had pushed them over the edge. "We'll get through this," David insisted as they tucked Lily into bed that night, trying to sound more confident than he felt. "Maybe it's just the stress of the move. We're all just exhausted." Evelyn nodded, not wanting to argue in front of Lily, but deep down she knew this was more than just stress. There was something malevolent in this house, something that had begun to dig its claws into her family. As they kissed Lily goodnight and left her room, Evelyn couldn't help but glance back, her heart aching at the sight of her daughter clutching Mr. Floppy like a lifeline. That night, Evelyn's sleep was plagued with dreams. She found herself standing in the basement, facing that same iron door. The air was thick with a damp, rotten smell, and the whispering voices surrounded her, echoing off the cold stone walls. She tried to move, to turn away, but her feet were rooted to the ground. The iron door creaked open slowly, revealing a pair of glowing red eyes staring at her from the darkness beyond. Then came the voice, a low, gravelly whisper. "Come closer, Evelyn. I'm waiting." She woke with a gasp, her heart racing, drenched in cold sweat. The room was silent, but she could still hear the echo of the voice in her mind. It had sounded so real, so close. She reached over to shake David awake, but he was already sitting up, his eyes wide and staring at the bedroom door. "Did you hear it?" he whispered, his voice trembling. Evelyn nodded, her mouth too dry to speak. She had hoped it was just a nightmare, but the look on David's face told her he had heard it too. Before they could speak, a loud thud came from down the hall, followed by the unmistakable sound of Lily's screams. They bolted from the bed, racing down the hallway to Lily's room. The door was already ajar, and when they burst inside, they found Lily standing in the middle of her bed, her eyes wild with terror. The room was freezing, their breath misting in the air despite the heater being on full blast. "Lily, what's wrong?" Evelyn cried, rushing to her daughter's side. Lily's small body was shaking uncontrollably. She pointed toward the corner of her room, her finger trembling. He was there," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "The man, he was standing right there." David turned the flashlight in the direction Lily was pointing, but there was nothing there except shadows and the peeling wallpaper. He crossed the room, opening the closet door and checking under the bed, but it was empty. "There's no one here, sweetie," David said softly, trying to soothe her. It was just a bad dream. But Lily shook her head, tears streaming down her cheeks. "No, it wasn't a dream. He told me he was going to take me away. He said I belonged to him now." David and Evelyn exchanged a horrified glance. The words sent a chill down Evelyn's spine. She wrapped her arms around Lily, holding her tightly. "We're here, honey. No one's going to take you away," she whispered, trying to keep her voice steady. But even as she spoke the words, she couldn't shake the feeling that they were hollow promises. After they finally managed to calm Lily down, Evelyn insisted she sleep in their bed for the night. None of them could bear the thought of leaving her alone in her room. The three of them huddled together, and eventually, exhaustion took over. Lily drifted off first, then David, but Evelyn lay awake, staring into the darkness, her mind racing. It was around 3 a.m. when she heard it again, the whisper. This time it was so faint, so close. It almost felt like someone was breathing directly into her ear. Evelyn, her blood turned to ice. She shot up in bed, her eyes darting around the room, but there was no one there. David and Lily were still sound asleep beside her. She tried to convince herself it was just her imagination, but the sound had been so clear, so real. Summoning her courage, Evelyn slipped out of bed, careful not to wake her family. She grabbed her flashlight and made her way into the hallway, the floorboards creaking beneath her feet. The house was deathly silent, the kind of silence that made the hairs on the back of her neck stand on end. She stood there, listening, waiting for any sign of movement. Then, just as she was about to turn back, she heard it again, a faint scratching sound, like nails dragging against wood. It was coming from Lily's room. Heart racing, she crept toward the door, her flashlight shaking in her hand. The door was slightly ajar, and as she pushed it open, the scratching stopped abruptly. The room was cold, colder than it had any right to be, and the air smelled faintly of something burnt. She shone her flashlight around, her heart pounding. The beam landed on the closet door, which was slightly open. It hadn't been like that earlier, she was sure of it. Swallowing hard, Evelyn reached for the handle, every instinct screaming at her to turn and run. But she had to know. The door creaked open, revealing the dark interior. At first, there was nothing but Lily's hanging clothes and a pile of toys at the bottom. But then, in the far corner, something moved. A faint, rustling sound, like fabric dragging across the floor. Evelyn's flashlight flickered, the beam dimming. She could barely make out a shape, crouched in the corner, its outline shifting in the darkness. It was tall, impossibly thin, and its eyes, oh God, its eyes. They were glowing faintly, a sickly yellow, like the eyes of a predator watching its prey. A sudden, inhuman hiss filled the room, and before Evelyn could react, the figure lunged toward her. She screamed, stumbling backward, but the moment she hit the floor, the figure vanished. The closet was empty, save for Lily's clothes swaying gently, as if something had just brushed past them. Trembling, Evelyn scrambled to her feet and ran back to the bedroom, her heart slamming against her ribs. She slammed the door shut, her breath coming in ragged gasps. David and Lily were still asleep, completely unaware of what had just transpired. As Evelyn stood there, panting, she noticed something horrifying. wet footprints leading from the hallway to her side of the bed. The whispers returned, soft and taunting, just outside the door. "Evelyn, let me in, let me in." But the most chilling part was not the voice. It was the faint giggle that followed, echoing through the darkness, a sound that, once again, was identical to Lily's. And as the giggling faded, Evelyn realized with growing dread that whatever was in the house was no longer just interested in scaring them. It was preparing to claim what it had come for. The next morning, Evelyn could barely hold herself together. Every creak of the floorboards, every gust of wind rattling the old windows set her on edge. She hadn't slept a wink after the encounter in Lily's room. The visions, the whispers, the wet footprints, they were no longer isolated incidents. They were becoming a relentless assault on their sanity. David noticed Evelyn's pale, drawn face and the dark circles under her eyes. He tried to brush off her worries as just stress and exhaustion, but deep down, even he couldn't deny that something was terribly wrong in this house. "Let's get some fresh air," David suggested after breakfast. "We've been cooped up inside for too long." Evelyn nodded reluctantly. It was a clear, crisp day, the first hint of winter in the air. They bundled Lily in a warm coat, her tiny fingers clutching Mr. Floppy as if it was the only thing tethering her to reality. The family ventured out into the overgrown backyard, hoping the sunlight might chase away some of the shadows that had settled over their lives. The yard was wild and untamed, with tall grass that nearly reached their knees. Beyond it, the dark woods loomed, thick with gnarled trees that seemed to bend inward as if conspiring to hide something. As they wandered through the backyard, Lily's mood brightened a bit. She skipped ahead, her laughter, though faint, a welcome relief after nights filled with screams and tears. But her playful mood was short-lived. "Mommy, Daddy, look! I found something!" Lily called out, her voice tinged with excitement. David and Evelyn hurried over to where Lily was standing at the edge of the clearing. The ground beneath her feet had collapsed into a slight depression, revealing the jagged stones of what appeared to be an old, forgotten well. The stones were moss-covered and slick, the well's opening barely visible under the tangle of vines and weeds. "Be careful, Lily," David warned, pulling her back. "You shouldn't get too close." Evelyn's stomach tightened as she looked at the well. There was something distinctly wrong about it, something that made her want to pull her daughter as far away as possible. The air around the well seemed colder, almost as if it was leaching warmth from the sunlit yard. David knelt down to inspect it, brushing away the leaves and debris covering the opening. "It's an old well," he muttered. "Looks like it hasn't been used in decades." As he leaned closer, a faint, fetid smell wafted up from the darkness below. It was the same sickly sweet odor that Evelyn had noticed in the house, the same scent that seemed to follow the wet footprints and linger in Lily's room. "Let's cover this back up," Evelyn said, her voice trembling. "We don't need any more hazards around here." David nodded, but before he could pull Lily away, she stepped closer, her eyes fixed on the well's opening. "Lily, stay back," Evelyn warned again, her voice sharper now. But Lily seemed entranced, her gaze locked on the darkness below. "I hear them," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "The voices, they're calling my name again." Evelyn's blood ran cold. "What are you talking about, sweetie?" she asked, trying to keep her voice steady. Lily didn't respond. Her eyes were glassy, unfocused, like she was in a trance. She leaned forward, peering into the depths of the well, her lips moving silently as if she were listening to someone only she could hear. David grabbed Lily and pulled her back with a force that made her cry out. "Enough of that, Lily. It's just an old well. There's nothing down there." But even as he said it, a cold wind blew through the clearing, carrying with it a faint, whispering sound. Evelyn could swear she heard it two soft, sibilant voices calling her daughter's name. "Lily!" After dragging Lily away from the well, they returned to the house, shaken and unnerved. Evelyn kept glancing over her shoulder, half expecting to see something following them fro. Inside, the house felt darker, as if the light of day had been swallowed by the shadows creeping through the hallways. David, trying to ease the tension, suggested they clean out the attic that afternoon. "It'll take our minds off things," he said, though the doubt in his voice was clear. Lily was reluctant to be left alone, so they brought her up to the attic with them. As they sorted through the dust-covered relics of the past, Evelyn couldn't stop thinking about the well and the voices Lily had heard. What if the whispers in the house and the sounds coming from the well were connected? While David was busy moving old boxes, Evelyn noticed Lily standing by the attic window, staring out toward the woods. Her expression was distant, her lips moving again as if she were having a conversation. "Lily, who are you talking to?" Evelyn asked, trying to keep her voice calm. Lily turned slowly, her eyes unfocused, almost vacant. "He says I need to go to the well," she whispered. "He's waiting for me there." Evelyn's heart dropped. "Who's waiting, Lily? Who are you talking about?" But Lily didn't answer. Instead, she turned back to the window, humming a soft, tuneless song. It was the same melody Evelyn had heard whispered in her own nightmares. That night, Evelyn and David decided to lock all the doors and windows, hoping to keep whatever was haunting them at bay. But as they tried to settle in for the night, it was clear that the house had other plans. Around midnight, Evelyn woke to the sound of creaking floorboards. At first, she thought it was David, but when she turned over, she saw him lying beside her, sound asleep. The sound continued, moving slowly down the hallway, accompanied by that now all too familiar dripping noise. Determined not to let the fear control her, Evelyn grabbed the flashlight and slipped out of bed. The house was freezing, her breath misting in the air. As she made her way down the hallway, the dripping grew louder, leading her toward the back of the house. She stopped at the window overlooking the backyard, her heart pounding in her chest. The moonlight bathed the yard in a pale, ghostly glow, and from the window she could see the well. Her blood turned to ice. The iron cover they had placed over it earlier was gone. A dark figure stood beside the well, hunched over, its long, spindly arms reaching into the black depths below. The figure moved slowly, methodically, as if it were pulling something up from the well. Evelyn's scream caught in her throat. She blinked, and the figure was gone. The yard was empty once more, the well's dark mouth gaping open like a wound. She turned to race back to her bedroom, but as she did, she heard it again, the faint giggling of a child, echoing through the house. "Lily, Lily!" The voice was coming from Lily's room. Panic surged through Evelyn as she sprinted down the hallway. She threw open Lily's door, her flashlight flickering wildly, but the bed was empty, the sheets thrown aside. Lily was gone. In the dead silence that followed, Evelyn heard a single, chilling whisper from the hallway behind her. "Come to the well, Evelyn. She's waiting." The voice was unmistakable. It was her daughter's voice, soft, pleading, desperate. But deep down, Evelyn knew. Whatever was speaking to her, it was not Lily. Evelyn's heart was racing, her mind spinning with terror as she frantically searched the house for Lily. She could still hear that haunting whisper, echoing in her daughter's voice, urging her to come to the well. But she knew that whatever was calling her, whatever had taken Lily, was not her daughter. It was something far darker, far more malevolent. David joined her in the frantic search, his face pale and drenched in sweat. They turned the house upside down, checking closets, under beds, and every dark corner. But there was no sign of Lily. "Where could she have gone?" David shouted, his voice cracking with desperation. "We locked every door, every window." Evelyn's hands were shaking, her thoughts racing back to the well. The iron cover had been moved. Had Lily somehow made her way outside? But how could she have? They would have heard her, wouldn't they? As if sensing Evelyn's thoughts, David grabbed her arm. "The well," he said, his voice barely a whisper. She was talking about it earlier today. What if... "No," Evelyn cut him off, shaking her head violently. "She couldn't have gone out there. She's hiding somewhere." But even as she said it, a dark dread settled over her. They both knew they had to check the well. Whatever had been calling Lily had lured her there, and they had to get to her before it was too late. Before they ventured outside, Evelyn had an idea. "Wait," she said, gripping David's arm. "The journal. There has to be something in there, something that explains what's happening." David nodded reluctantly, and they rushed to the basement where Evelyn had found the old journal days earlier, hidden behind a loose brick. The air was even colder now, the chill seeping into their bones. As they pulled the journal out, the basement seemed to darken, the shadows pressing in on them, as if the house itself was watching. The journal was worn and yellowed, its leather cover cracked with age. Evelyn opened it to the first page, her hands trembling. It was written in spidery handwriting, difficult to decipher in places, but the words that she could make out sent shivers down her spine. October 13th, 1876. The house has turned cold, colder than I have ever felt. The whispers have begun again. It is always the same calling my name, urging me to come to the well. I tried to resist, but it speaks with the voices of those I love, voices I know have long been dead. Evelyn flipped through the pages, her heart pounding faster with each new entry. The journal belonged to someone named Amos Thorne, who described how the house had been in his family for generations. But the further she read, the more she realized that it wasn't just an ordinary family home. November 1st, 1876. It is not a well, not truly. It is a gateway, a hungry mouth that feeds on those who listen to its whispers. My wife Maria was the first to go. She heard the voices and went willingly, convinced she would find our lost son. But all I found was her lifeless body at the bottom, her eyes wide open and her mouth twisted into a scream. "David, listen to this," Evelyn said, her voice shaking. She read the passage aloud, and David's face grew paler with every word. "Are you saying that well is some kind of portal?" he asked, his voice barely a whisper. It's feeding on us," Evelyn said, her eyes wide with realization. "It uses the voices of our loved ones to lure people in. Once they get close, it takes them." David rubbed his hands over his face, trying to keep it together. "We need to find Lily, Evelyn. We can't waste any more time." But just as they turned to leave, Evelyn's eyes fell on another entry, hastily scrawled near the back of the journal. It was dated just a few days before Amos Thorne's final entry. December 4th, 1876. There is a ritual, a way to seal the well, to stop the voices, but it comes at a terrible price. A life must be given willingly. Only then will the well be sated. Only then will it sleep. Evelyn's blood turned to ice. "A sacrifice," she muttered, horrified. "That's how they sealed it before." David stared at her, his eyes wide with disbelief. "No, we can't do that. There has to be another way." But Evelyn couldn't stop reading. The last entry was written in a shaky, desperate hand. December 7, 1876. It's too late for me. The whispers have become too strong, and I hear them even in my dreams. Tonight I will go to the well, not as a sacrifice, but to end this curse once and for all. If anyone finds this journal, know that the well cannot be trusted. Whatever you hear, whatever it promises you, do not listen. As she finished reading, the house seemed to groan, the air around them tightening like a noose. The whispers returned, louder and more insistent now, as if they were coming from the very walls. Evelyn, David, come to the well. Without another word, they bolted up the stairs, clutching the journal as if it were a lifeline. Outside, the night was thick with fog, the moon hidden behind a blanket of dark clouds. The temperature had dropped drastically, and the air felt heavy, almost suffocating. Evelyn and David ran across the yard, their flashlights cutting feeble paths through the mist. As they reached the well, they were met with a horrifying sight. The iron cover they had placed on it earlier was completely gone, flung aside like a discarded toy. And there, standing at the edge, was Lily. "Lily!" Evelyn screamed, her heart lurching. But Lily didn't turn around. She stood perfectly still, her back to them, staring down into the depths of the well. David lunged forward, but as he reached out to grab her, Lily turned to face them. Her eyes were hollow, her expression blank, as if she were sleepwalking. "Lily, it's okay, baby," Evelyn pleaded, stepping closer. "We're here. Come away from the well." But Lily didn't respond. Instead, she tilted her head to the side, a strange, twisted smile curling her lips. And when she spoke, her voice was not her own. It was deep, guttural, like 1,000 voices speaking in unison. "She belongs to us now," the voice growled. "You cannot save her, but you can take her place." David's face twisted with rage and fear. "What do you want?" he shouted into the darkness. "Let her go." The voice laughed, a sound that sent shivers down Evelyn's spine. "A life for a life. One of you must enter the well willingly. Only then will she be freed." Evelyn's mind was spinning, the journal's final entry flashing through her thoughts. The ritual, the sacrifice, it was all true. The well was demanding a soul. "David, no," Evelyn whispered, grabbing his arm. We can't give in to it." But David's eyes were locked on their daughter, who stood teetering on the edge of the well. "I won't lose her, Evelyn," he said, his voice breaking. "I'll go. I'll do it." Before Evelyn could stop him, David rushed forward, grabbing Lily and pulling her away from the well. But as he did, the ground beneath them began to tremble, the air filled with that horrible, guttural laughter. "Run, Evelyn!" David shouted, shoving Lily into her mother's arms. "Get her out of here, now!" Evelyn hesitated, tears streaming down her face, but David's eyes were fierce, determined. "I love you," he whispered. Then, without another word, he turned and leaped into the darkness of the well. A deafening scream filled the air, the ground shaking violently beneath them. The whispers grew louder, more frantic, then abruptly stopped. The well sealed itself with a horrifying crunch, as if the earth had swallowed it whole. Evelyn stood there, clutching Lily, her mind reeling. The whispers were gone, the air was still, but David was gone too. All that remained was the silence, and the knowledge that the well had been sated, at least for now. The house was quiet, unnervingly so. The whispers that had once haunted every shadowy corner had ceased, but the silence that replaced them felt oppressive, heavy, like the calm before an impending storm. Evelyn sat on the edge of her bed, staring vacantly at the wall. The events of the night replayed in her mind like a nightmare on repeat. David's desperate leap into the well, the sound of the earth sealing shut behind him, and the bone-chilling silence that followed. She had saved Lily, but it had cost her everything. Evelyn's eyes were red and swollen from crying. Lily, too, had not spoken a word since they returned from the well. The little girl was curled up in her mother's bed, clutching Mr. Floppy to her chest, her wide eyes staring into the darkness. Evelyn tried to comfort her, but there were no words to make sense of what had happened. How could she explain that her father had sacrificed himself to save them from something neither of them could truly understand? The morning sun filtered weakly through the grimy windows, casting a pale light on the dusty floor. Evelyn hadn't slept a wink, afraid that if she closed her eyes, she would hear David's voice again, or worse, see the hollow-eyed figure that had spoken through Lily. Lily was the first to stir, her eyes heavy with exhaustion. Evelyn helped her dress and coaxed her downstairs to the kitchen, hoping that some semblance of a normal routine would help. But the house, once merely eerie, now felt like a tomb. Every creak of the old wooden floorboards sent chills down Evelyn's spine. She couldn't shake the feeling that something, or someone, was watching them. As Evelyn made breakfast, her hands trembling, Lily sat at the table in silence, her eyes unfocused. Evelyn placed a bowl of cereal in front of her, but Lily just stared at it. "Sweetheart," Evelyn said softly, kneeling next to her, "you have to eat. You need your strength." Lily slowly turned to her mother, her eyes distant. "Is Daddy coming back?" she asked, her voice a fragile whisper. Evelyn's heart shattered. She had no answer. Instead, she hugged Lily tightly, trying to hide the tears that streamed down her face. "No, honey, Daddy's gone," she whispered, her voice breaking. "But he did it to protect us. He wanted us to be safe." But even as she said it, she couldn't help but feel that the house was far from safe. The malevolent presence that had lured David to his death might have been temporarily sated, but Evelyn couldn't shake the feeling that it wasn't over. Later that afternoon, Evelyn decided that she couldn't stay in the house any longer. She needed to get out, clear her mind, and try to figure out what to do next. She bundled Lily up and took her for a walk through the woods surrounding the property. The trees were bare, their skeletal branches reaching up to a gray sky. The air was frigid, biting at their exposed skin. But despite the cold, Evelyn felt a strange sense of relief being outside, away from the suffocating darkness of the house. She hoped that a walk might help ease Lily's fear too. Lily, however, seemed even more withdrawn, her eyes darting nervously as if she expected something to jump out from behind the trees. "Everything's going to be okay," Evelyn said, trying to reassure both herself and her daughter. But as they walked deeper into the woods, Evelyn began to feel that same unnerving sensation she had felt in the house, the feeling of being watched. It started as a whisper of unease, a prickling sensation on the back of her neck. She kept glancing over her shoulder, convinced she saw movement out of the corner of her eye, but every time she turned, there was nothing there. The trees stood silent, the forest floor undisturbed. But Lily sensed it too. She tightened her grip on Evelyn's hand, her eyes wide with terror. "Mommy," she whispered, "he's here." Evelyn's heart skipped a beat. "What do you mean, Lily? Who's here?" Lily didn't answer. Instead, she stared straight ahead, her eyes wide and unfocused, as if she were listening to something only she could hear. Evelyn's pulse quickened. She strained her ears, but all she could hear was the rustle of leaves and the faint whisper of the wind. "Lily, we're going back to the house," she said, trying to keep her voice steady. But as they turned to head back, a new sound cut through the cold air, a soft crunch, like someone stepping on dried leaves. Evelyn froze, her breath catching in her throat. Slowly, she turned around, her eyes scanning the woods behind them. There was nothing, just the trees, silent and still. But then she heard it again, another crunch, closer this time. It was as if someone or something was following them, matching their every step. The sensation of being watched intensified, and Evelyn's panic began to rise. Grabbing Lily's hand, she broke into a run, pulling her daughter along as they sprinted back toward the house. The sound of footsteps followed them, echoing in the cold, damp air, always just out of sight. It was as if the forest itself was alive, reaching out to claim them. When they finally burst through the door of the house, Evelyn slammed it shut behind them, her chest heaving with exertion. The footsteps stopped abruptly, as if whatever was following them had melted back into the shadows. Lily was sobbing, her tiny body trembling. "He's going to take me, Mommy," she whimpered. "He said it's not over." Evelyn hugged her daughter tightly, her mind racing. The journal had said the well could be temporarily sealed with a sacrifice. But what if that wasn't enough? What if whatever was inside it was still hungry, still searching for another soul to claim? That night, as the wind howled outside, Evelyn tried to keep herself busy, distracting her mind from the creeping dread that had taken root in her heart. She searched the house for any clue, any hidden journal or letter that might reveal more about the well and the curse that seemed to haunt this place. While rifling through a pile of old books in the attic, she found a small leather-bound diary tucked behind a dusty box. It was older than the journal she had found before, its pages brittle with age. The entries were written in a different hand, shakier, more erratic. One entry caught her eye. October 1891. "We tried to seal it again, but it was not enough. The well is never truly satisfied. It does not just crave a single soul, it craves the family. It will take them one by one, pulling them into its darkness, until its hunger is sated. Even after the ritual, it will follow, it will haunt, it will take, until there is nothing left." Evelyn's hands began to shake as she read the final, hastily scrawled entry. "He came for my wife, and now he comes for me. I hear him whispering my name, just as he whispered hers. There is no escape. Once you have heard his voice, you are marked. He will follow you, even in the daylight, even in your dreams." A cold, paralyzing fear gripped Evelyn. The footsteps in the woods, the whispers, Lily's strange behavior, it all made sense now. Whatever was inside the well had not been satisfied with David's sacrifice. It was coming for them, and it wouldn't stop until it claimed them all. As Evelyn closed the diary, She heard it again, the faint, familiar sound of footsteps in the hallway just outside the attic door. The house, the forest, the well, it was all connected, and now it was hunting them. Evelyn knew with a cold certainty that the nightmare was far from over. The house felt darker than ever, the shadows clinging to every corner like a shroud. Evelyn could no longer tell if it was day or night. The oppressive gloom seemed to permeate the walls, swallowing what little light seeped through the dirty windows. It had been 2 days since David's sacrifice, and the house seemed to be growing hungrier by the hour. Lily had not spoken since their frantic return from the woods. She wandered through the house like a ghost, her eyes vacant, her lips moving silently, as if she were talking to someone only she could see. Evelyn watched her daughter with growing dread, feeling helpless to stop whatever was happening to her. The diary entries she had found in the attic haunted Evelyn's thoughts. The entity in the well, it seemed, did not just demand a single life. It was insatiable, a malevolent force that would stop at nothing until it had devoured an entire bloodline. David's sacrifice had only delayed the inevitable. Now the darkness was closing in once again, its eyes set on Lily. Evelyn knew they needed to leave, but something was keeping them trapped. Every time she tried to muster the courage to pack up and go, an overwhelming sense of dread would flood her mind, paralyzing her with fear. It was as if the house itself was holding them hostage, keeping them within its grasp. On the third morning after David's disappearance, Evelyn woke to the sound of Lily screaming. She bolted out of bed, heart racing, and ran down the hallway to her daughter's room. When she burst through the door, she found Lily standing in front of the bathroom sink, her tiny hands gripping the edge of the porcelain so tightly her knuckles had turned white. The faucet was running, but instead of clear water, a thick, black sludge poured out, swirling like a living thing as it filled the sink. "Lily, get away from there!" Evelyn shouted, grabbing her daughter and pulling her back. The stench of rotten decay hit her like a physical blow, nearly making her gag. The black substance continued to flow, spilling over the sides of the sink and spreading across the floor in oily tendrils. Lily's eyes were wide with terror, but she wasn't looking at the black water. She was staring into the mirror above the sink, her reflection distorted and wrong. In the warped glass, Evelyn saw her own face, twisted into a hideous grin that did not match the fear in her eyes. The reflection began to move on its own, its mouth opening wide as if to scream, but no sound came out. Instead, the mirror began to crack, spiderwebs of fractures spreading across the glass. Evelyn grabbed Lily and yanked her away, just as the mirror shattered, shards of glass spraying the room like deadly rain. The faucet abruptly shut off, the room plunging into silence. The black sludge that had spilled onto the floor slowly began to retreat, seeping back into the drain as if it had a mind of its own. The stench lingered, hanging in the air like a miasma. Evelyn was shaking, her hands gripping Lily's shoulders. "Are you okay, baby? Did it touch you?" Lily's eyes were unfocused, her face pale. She shook her head slowly, her lips trembling. It whispered to me," she said in a small, trembling voice. "It said Daddy is waiting for us, down in the well." Evelyn's blood ran cold. She tried to calm Lily, but the look in her daughter's eyes sent chills down her spine. It wasn't just fear, there was something else, something dark and distant, as if a piece of Lily's spirit had already been taken. That night, the house became a prison of horrors. The whispers had returned, louder and more insistent, echoing through the walls like 1,000 voices trapped in the darkness. The floorboards creaked with unseen footsteps, and every so often Evelyn could hear soft scratching sounds behind the walls, like something trying to claw its way out. Lily refused to sleep in her own bed, so Evelyn set up a small cot in her room, keeping her daughter close. The child barely spoke now, only muttering under her breath to whatever invisible force seemed to have taken root inside her mind. Evelyn tried to stay awake, tried to keep watch, but exhaustion overtook her. She slipped into a fitful sleep. her dreams filled with images of David's hollow eyes staring up at her from the depths of the well, his mouth twisted into a grotesque smile. She awoke to the sound of water dripping. At first, she thought it was the bathroom faucet again, but the sound was too close, too loud. She sat up, heart pounding, and turned on her bedside lamp. The sight that greeted her made her stomach lurch. The walls of her bedroom were oozing thick, black water, the same sludge she had seen earlier in the bathroom. It seeped from the cracks, dripping down in slow, viscous streams that pooled on the floor. The air was thick with the smell of decay. "Lily, wake up!" Evelyn shouted, shaking her daughter awake. Lily blinked up at her, her eyes glazed with exhaustion. But then her expression changed, her eyes widening in horror. "Mommy, behind you!" she screamed. Evelyn spun around just in time to see a shadowy figure materialize from the black water. It was tall, impossibly thin, with elongated arms that reached out like tendrils. Its face was a grotesque mockery of a human, its mouth stretched into a wide, unnatural grin. Before she could react, the figure lunged toward her. Evelyn grabbed Lily and bolted from the room, slamming the door behind her. She could hear the thing pounding on the other side, its distorted laughter filling the hallway. "Come to the well, Evelyn," it hissed, its voice a guttural croak. "Bring the child, it's not over." With her heart pounding and tears streaming down her face, Evelyn dragged Lily down the stairs. They had to get out of the house. She didn't care about the freezing night air, the darkness outside. Anything was better than staying in this cursed place. But as they reached the front door, the knob wouldn't turn. It was as if the house itself had locked them in. Desperation clawed at Evelyn's mind as she banged on the door, screaming for help. And then from behind her she heard Lily's soft voice, almost in a trance. "We have to go back to the well, Mommy. That's where Daddy is. He says it's the only way." Evelyn turned, her heart breaking. "No, Lily, we're not going back there." But Lily's eyes were not her own anymore. They were dark, hollow, filled with a malicious glee that sent chills down Evelyn's spine. "Daddy says he's waiting for you," Lily whispered, her lips curling into that twisted, unnatural smile. The whispers surged around them, a cacophony of voices rising to a fever pitch. The house seemed to close in on them, the walls groaning, the black water spreading, reaching for them. And in that moment, Evelyn realized the terrible truth. The house, the well, whatever dark force was haunting them, it would never stop, not until it had taken everything. David's sacrifice had not been enough. The well was still hungry, and now it wanted Lily, and perhaps it wanted Evelyn too. The darkness in the house had reached a fever pitch, its malevolence seeping into every crack, every shadow, every breath Evelyn took. She had tried everything to escape, banging on the doors, breaking the windows. Nothing worked. It was as if the house had become a living, breathing entity, determined to keep them within its clutches. After what felt like hours of frantic attempts to break free, Evelyn collapsed against the front door, panting, clutching Lily close. Lily had gone eerily quiet again, her eyes glassy, almost like she was sleepwalking. Every so often she would whisper something to herself, her lips moving silently as if speaking to an unseen presence. Evelyn's mind was spiraling into despair when she heard it, a knock on the door. It was faint at first, like someone tapping gently, but it grew louder, more insistent. Evelyn's heart leaped into her throat. Who could possibly be outside in the middle of the night, especially after everything that had happened? Steeling herself, Evelyn hesitated only for a moment before she pulled the door open. Standing on the other side was an old man, his face weathered and lined like cracked leather. He wore a heavy coat, its collar turned up against the cold wind. His eyes were pale blue, almost milky, as if age had clouded them, but they were sharp with concern. "Mrs. Thorne?" he asked, his voice rough with age. Evelyn stared at him in confusion. Who are you?" "My name's Thompson," the old man replied, glancing nervously at the house behind her. "I live in the town nearby. I was a friend of Amos Thorne, the previous owner. When I saw the lights in this house again, I knew I had to come." Evelyn felt a chill run down her spine at the mention of Amos Thorne, the name she had seen in the journal. "What are you talking about?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. The old man stepped forward, his expression grim. "You need to get out of this house. The Thorne family, they tried to seal it away, but they failed. They couldn't stop it, and neither can you." Evelyn's heart pounded in her chest. "What do you mean? What's happening to us? What is this thing in the well?" Mr. Thompson shook his head, his eyes filled with a sorrow that seemed to span decades. "I've seen it before with Amos. He tried to break the curse, tried to save his family, but once it takes hold, there's no stopping it. That well isn't just a hole in the ground, it's a doorway to something that should never have been let into our world." He leaned closer, his voice dropping to a whisper. "It doesn't just feed on one soul, it craves families. It wants to consume you all, one by one, until there's nothing left. That's why it's taken your husband. But it's not satisfied. It never is." Evelyn's knees nearly buckled. "David, he's gone because of that thing?" She could barely choke out the words, her mind reeling with the horror of it all. Thompson nodded slowly. "Amos tried to seal it just as your husband did, but all he managed to do was delay the inevitable. The well, it will keep coming back, keep whispering until it drags every last one of you down with it." Evelyn's breath hitched, panic rising like a tidal wave. But there has to be a way. There has to be something we can do to stop it." The old man sighed heavily, looking down at his worn boots as if weighing his next words carefully. "There's only one way to break its hold entirely, but it's not a solution you're going to like." "What is it?" Evelyn demanded, desperation coloring her voice. "The well demands a willing sacrifice," Thompson said softly. "But not just any life. It must be a blood relative of those who've already been taken, a parent or a child." His gaze flicked to Lily, who stood silently by her mother's side, her eyes glazed over. Evelyn felt as though the ground had dropped out from beneath her. "No," she whispered, shaking her head violently. "No, I won't do it. I won't sacrifice my daughter. There has to be another way." Mr. Thompson's face softened, but his eyes were filled with a sorrow that bordered on pity. "I don't blame you for refusing, Mrs. Thorne, but you have to understand, if you don't do it willingly, the well will take her anyway. And it won't stop there. It will take you too, just like it took Amos's wife and children, just like it took your husband." "No!" Evelyn shouted, tears streaming down her face. "There has to be another way. I won't let it take her." Mr. Thompson reached into his coat pocket and pulled out a small, worn, leather-bound book. "This belonged to Amos. It's a grimoire, old magic, dangerous, but it might hold something that could help you. But I warn you, it's filled with rituals and incantations that are not to be taken lightly." Evelyn took the book with trembling hands, her mind racing. She had already read Amos's journal, but this was something darker, something that might just hold the key to ending this nightmare, if she dared to use it. "Please, Mrs. Thorne," Thompson said, his voice urgent. "If you choose to fight, you'll need to be quick. The well grows hungrier by the hour, and it's already marked you and the child. If you wait too long, it won't matter what rituals you try, it will take you both." Evelyn nodded numbly, clutching the grimoire to her chest. She could hear Lily mumbling again, her voice soft and distant, as if she were in a trance. "Thank you," Evelyn whispered, though the words felt hollow. I'll try to find another way." The old man nodded, his eyes filled with a deep sadness. "God help you," he said, turning to leave. "But remember, if you cannot break its hold, you must choose quickly. The well won't wait." As the door closed behind Mr. Thompson, Evelyn was left standing in the oppressive silence of the house, the grimoire heavy in her hands. Lily's soft whispering filled the air, her words slipping into that strange, otherworldly language she had never spoken before. The house groaned as if in anticipation, and then, clear as day, Lily turned to her mother with a smile that was not her own. "Mommy," she said in a sing-song voice, "the well says you don't have much time. It wants me back, or it will take you instead." The words sent a jolt of terror through Evelyn's spine. The well was growing impatient. Whatever she was going to do, she needed to do it fast. She had to make a choice. Risk delving into the dark magic of the grimoire, or consider the unthinkable, a sacrifice to end the nightmare once and for all. Evelyn's hands trembled as she opened the ancient book. Pages filled with cryptic symbols and dark incantations stared back at her. Somewhere deep in the house, a door creaked open on its own. The black water had begun to seep from the walls again, pooling at her feet, its icy touch sending a chill up her spine. The well was calling, the house was closing in, and time was running out. The grimoire lay open on the dusty kitchen table, its yellowed pages filled with cryptic symbols and handwritten notes in a language that Evelyn could barely decipher. She flipped through the pages frantically, her hands shaking. The air in the house had turned icy cold, and the black water continued to ooze from the cracks in the walls, its stench permeating everything. Evelyn glanced up to check on Lily. Her daughter sat across the table, her eyes glazed, staring at the kitchen wall as if entranced by something only she could see. Occasionally her lips would move, whispering words that made no sense. It was as if she were in a waking dream, or worse, under someone's control. Evelyn's panic intensified. The grimoire had to have an answer, some ritual, some spell that could sever the connection between Lily and the dark force that was calling to her. But every page seemed to grow darker, more incomprehensible, the words swirling before her eyes as if mocking her desperation. As she struggled to focus, the house creaked ominously, the shadows in the corners seeming to pulse and writhe like living things. It was as if the entire structure was reacting to her attempts to resist its hold, punishing her for trying to break free. "Snap out of it, Evelyn," she told herself. "If you can't figure this out, you'll lose her. You'll lose everything." Evelyn's eyes landed on a page covered in strange, swirling runes. It was titled Ritual of Severance, and beneath it was a hastily scrawled note. "When the shadows claim your blood, sever the tether with a soul bound willingly. But beware, refusal to fulfill the contract will awaken the well's true hunger." Evelyn's breath hitched. The ritual required an object connected to the one being held captive. She glanced at Lily, who was still mumbling to herself, her fingers clutching Mr. Floppy, her beloved stuffed rabbit. Could it be that the bond was tied to that toy? Before she could think further, there was a loud crash from upstairs. The sound reverberated through the house, shaking the walls and sending dust raining down from the ceiling. Evelyn's heart leaped into her throat. It was coming from the attic. "Lily, stay here," she ordered, but her daughter didn't respond, her eyes still fixed on whatever invisible presence held her attention. Evelyn grabbed the grimoire, tucking it under her arm as she sprinted up the stairs, her heart pounding. The air grew colder with each step, and by the time she reached the attic door, her breath was misting in front of her face. The door to the attic was slightly ajar, a thin line of darkness spilling through the gap. She hesitated, dread pooling in her stomach, but the sound of a child's laughter, faint, distorted, urged her forward. Slowly, she pushed the door open and stepped inside. The attic was pitch dark, the only light coming from her flickering flashlight. Boxes filled with dusty relics from a bygone era were stacked haphazardly, casting long, jagged shadows that seemed to shift and move in the periphery of her vision. Evelyn's gaze landed on the cracked, antique mirror leaning against the far wall. It was a large, ornate piece with a tarnished silver frame, something she hadn't noticed before. The surface of the mirror was shattered, the cracks spiderwebbing outward from the center. As she stepped closer, she could see her reflection fractured into a dozen distorted pieces. And then something moved behind the glass. She froze. Her reflection stayed perfectly still, but the space behind it twisted, a shadow rippling just beneath the surface. Evelyn's heart hammered in her chest as the shadow took form, coalescing into the shape of a man. The figure was tall and gaunt, its eyes glowing with an unnatural light. "David," she whispered, her voice trembling. The figure in the mirror grinned, its mouth stretching impossibly wide. It looked like David, but Evelyn knew instantly that whatever was staring back at her was not her husband. The eyes were hollow, soulless, and filled with a hunger that sent chills down her spine. The thing that wore David's face leaned closer to the glass, its grin widening. "Come to the well, Evelyn," it hissed, its voice a twisted parody of her husband's. "Bring her to me. Bring our daughter, and this will all end." "No," Evelyn choked out, shaking her head. "You're not him. I won't give her to you." The figure's expression darkened, its eyes blazing with fury. The mirror began to shake violently, and the cracks widened, shards of glass splintering and falling to the floor. The entire attic seemed to groan in response, the floorboards creaking as if something beneath was trying to push its way up. "Then you will join him," the voice growled. "You will both belong to me." Evelyn staggered back as the mirror shattered completely, sending shards flying through the air. She threw her arms up to shield her face, the jagged pieces slicing into her skin. A cold, inhuman laugh filled the attic, reverberating off the walls. The black water began to seep up through the floorboards, pooling around her feet, cold and viscous like a living thing. It seemed to pulse, inching closer, as if it were trying to pull her into its depths. Panicking, Evelyn stumbled toward the door, clutching the grimoire to her chest. But as she reached for the doorknob, it melted away, the wood warping into grotesque shapes that resembled skeletal hands reaching out to grab her. She was trapped. Downstairs, Lily's voice echoed through the house. "Mommy, he says we're running out of time." Evelyn's heart sank. She had to get back to her daughter before the well could claim her. She needed to find a way to end this nightmare once and for all. Gritting her teeth, Evelyn flipped through the grimoire frantically, her hands shaking. Finally, she found a ritual that might work. It was a desperate, dangerous spell designed to sever the well's hold on a marked soul, but it required blood, a connection to the one being held. Evelyn's eyes darted to her bleeding hands, the cuts from the shattered mirror still fresh. She had no time to think. She quickly pressed her bleeding palm to the pages of the grimoire, whispering the words inscribed there. "By blood and by will I sever the tether. By pain and sacrifice I break the hold. Release the child, take me instead." The attic went deathly silent, the black water suddenly receding, as if retreating from the force of the spell. But then the house shuddered violently, and a deafening roar filled the air. The shadows in the room twisted, convulsed, and then with a final, ear-splitting crack, everything went still. Evelyn slumped to the floor, her vision blurring, her strength drained from the ritual. She could hear Lily's voice calling her faintly from downstairs, but it sounded distant, almost like it was coming from another world. "Mommy, Mommy, please come back." Gathering the last of her strength, Evelyn forced herself to her feet and staggered toward the door, which had finally returned to its normal shape. The house was silent now, the oppressive darkness that had filled it seeming to lift. But as she made her way down the stairs, clutching the grimoire like a lifeline, she couldn't shake the feeling that she had only made things worse. The well was angry now, furious even. And whatever was inside it was no longer satisfied with whispers and threats. It was coming for them, and it was no longer content with a single sacrifice. As she reached the bottom of the stairs, she saw Lily standing in the hallway, her eyes wide with terror. "Mommy, he's here," Lily whispered, pointing toward the front door. The door slowly creaked open, revealing a figure standing on the other side. It was David, or what was left of him. "Evelyn," he said, his voice a horrible guttural rasp. "I told you, the well is never satisfied." The figure at the doorway looked like David, his familiar silhouette, the way he stood with one shoulder slightly slumped, but there was something terribly wrong. The once warm, gentle eyes that Evelyn had known for so many years were now hollow, black pits that seemed to drink in the light. His skin was ashen, with patches of dark rot spreading across his face, and his mouth twisted into a grotesque smile that revealed jagged, unnatural teeth. "Evelyn, I've missed you," he rasped, the voice like nails on a chalkboard. It was David's voice, but it was twisted, corrupted, as if spoken through a throat filled with gravel. Lily whimpered, clutching Mr. Floppy to her chest, her eyes wide with terror. "Mummy, that's not Daddy!" she cried, backing away until she was pressed against the wall. Evelyn's heart pounded so hard she thought it would burst out of her chest. She had seen David disappear into the well. She had heard his screams. Whatever was standing in front of her now was not her husband. It was something else, wearing his skin like a mask. "David, or whatever you are, stay back!" Evelyn shouted, holding up the grimoire as if it could somehow protect her. The pages fluttered in a sudden gust of cold wind, the ancient ink almost glowing in the dim light. The thing that wore David's face tilted its head, as if amused. "You think that little book can save you? The well is hungry, Evelyn, and you know the price. One sacrifice was not enough. It wants more. It wants you both." Before she could react, the creature lunged forward with unnatural speed, its claw-like hands reaching for her throat. Evelyn screamed and instinctively raised her arm to block the attack, but it was too fast. Just as its cold fingers brushed her skin, Lily let out a piercing scream. "Leave my mommy alone." The air seemed to vibrate, and the creature froze, its eyes widening in surprise. Lily's voice had a strange resonance to it, a power that Evelyn had never heard before. The entity that wore David's face hesitated, its grin faltering. Seeing her chance, Evelyn grabbed Lily's hand and pulled her away, sprinting down the hallway. "We need to get out of here," she yelled. But even as they ran, the house seemed to shift and warp around them, the walls stretching like sinew, closing in to trap them. Behind them, the creature howled in rage. The sound was otherworldly, a guttural roar that shook the very foundation of the house. "You cannot escape," it bellowed. "The well claims what it is owed." The temperature plummeted, and the black water began to seep through the cracks in the floor again, spreading like a creeping tide. Evelyn's feet slipped on the slick surface, nearly sending her sprawling, but she tightened her grip on Lily's hand and kept moving. The hallway seemed to stretch on endlessly, turning into a labyrinth of darkened corridors that Evelyn didn't recognize. Every door they passed slammed shut behind them, as if the house itself were trying to funnel them towards some dark fate. "Mommy, where are we going?" Lily gasped, her voice trembling with fear. "I don't know, honey," Evelyn admitted, tears streaming down her face. "I'm just trying to find a way out." But deep down, she knew the truth. There was no escaping the house. It had become an extension of the well's malevolent hunger, a prison designed to trap them until it got what it wanted. Finally, they burst into the living room, panting and desperate. The fireplace, which had been cold and unused for years, was now roaring with blue flames that cast eerie shadows across the room. In the center of the room stood Mr. Thompson, the old neighbor who had warned her just hours ago. But his face was twisted in horror, his eyes wide as if he had seen something unspeakable. "Thompson, what's happening?" Evelyn cried, clutching Lily to her side. The old man turned slowly, his eyes hollow. "I told you, the well never lets go," he whispered, his voice cracking. "It's not just a place. It's a hunger that consumes everything it touches. It will twist your loved ones into monsters, use their voices, their faces, to break you." As he spoke, the front door behind him swung open with a deafening crash, revealing the figure of David once more. Only now, his form was deteriorating rapidly, pieces of his flesh sloughing off to reveal the writhing black mass beneath. "Run, Evelyn!" Thompson shouted, stepping between her and the creature. "I'll hold it off as long as I can." "No, you can't," Evelyn began, but the old man turned to her with a look of resolve. "This is my debt to pay," he said, pulling a small vial from his coat and hurling it at the creature. The glass shattered, and the black mass screamed as the liquid hissed and bubbled on its surface. "Go!" Thompson roared, his voice filled with a desperation that sent Evelyn scrambling for the back door. Clutching Lily's hand, she fled, not daring to look back as the sound of Thompson's screams filled the air. They burst out into the cold night, the moon hidden behind thick clouds. The only light came from the house itself, which seemed to glow with an unnatural, sickly hue. Evelyn's lungs burned with every breath, but she kept running, dragging Lily toward the only place she could think of, the well. If the house was truly tied to the well, maybe, just maybe, she could end this nightmare where it began. The clearing where the well stood was even darker than before, the shadows so thick they seemed to swallow the light from her flashlight. The iron cover that they had placed over the well was once again pushed aside, as if whatever was inside had burst free. Lily pulled on her hand, her eyes wide with terror. "Mommy, we can't go back there. He's waiting for us." Evelyn knelt down, gripping Lily by the shoulders, forcing her to look into her eyes. "Listen to me, Lily. I need you to be brave, okay? I think we can stop this if we go to the well, if we face it." Lily's lower lip trembled, but she nodded slowly, tears welling up in her eyes. "I'm scared, Mommy." "I know, sweetie," Evelyn whispered, choking back her own sobs. "I am too, but we're going to do this together, all right?" With a deep breath, Evelyn pulled Lily closer to the well's edge. The air was frigid, and the foul smell of decay was overwhelming. She peered into the darkness below, her flashlight barely penetrating the inky depths. And then she saw it. Something was moving down there, writhing and slithering like a mass of serpents. The whispers grew louder, echoing up from the abyss. "Bring her to me," the voices hissed. "The child, the blood, it will end this." "No," Evelyn shouted into the darkness. "You can't have her!" The black water began to bubble up, spilling over the edges of the well. The ground beneath their feet trembled, and a bone-chilling cold seeped into Evelyn's bones. The well was angry, furious that she was defying it. In a moment of desperation, Evelyn opened the grimoire one last time, searching for a spell, a phrase, anything that might help. And there, at the very bottom of the page, was a single line. "Only by fire can the doorway be sealed." She turned to Lily. "We need to burn it, Lily. We need to end this once and for all." Lily nodded, her eyes filled with a newfound determination. Together they gathered what dry branches they could find and threw them into the well. Evelyn pulled a small lighter from her pocket, a relic from David, and flicked it to life. As the flames caught, the well erupted with a deafening scream, the black water hissing and recoiling from the fire. The ground shook violently, and the voices that had haunted them for so long shrieked in agony. For a moment, it felt like the world was collapsing around them. But then, as quickly as it had started, the screaming stopped. The ground stilled, the black water receded. The well was silent. Evelyn Colla, the dawn was a thin, gray line on the horizon when Evelyn and Lily finally made it back into the house. They were both exhausted, covered in dirt and sweat, their clothes soaked with the stench of the black water from the well. For now, the whispers had stopped, and the house seemed eerily calm, as if holding its breath. The flames they had set in the well were still burning, a thin column of smoke rising into the cold morning air. But Evelyn knew it was only a temporary fix. The fire had driven back whatever dark force lurked beneath, but she could still feel its presence, like a shadow pressing against the edges of her mind. The house, however, had become a silent observer. The walls no longer groaned, and the black water had stopped seeping from the cracks. For a moment, Evelyn dared to hope that maybe, just maybe, they had driven it back for good. But that hope was shattered as soon as she stepped through the front door. The house was in ruins. The furniture was overturned, shattered glass littered the floors, and the air was thick with the lingering scent of decay. It looked as if a hurricane had swept through the place. Lily clung to her side, her small body trembling. "Mommy, is it really over?" she whispered, her voice tinged with a hope Evelyn couldn't bear to squash. Evelyn forced a smile, brushing a hand through Lily's tangled hair. "For now, sweetie, for now." But deep down she knew better. The well wasn't done with them. Not yet. Evelyn couldn't afford to rest. She knew they were living on borrowed time. The grimoire, now worn and covered in her own blood from the ritual, had hinted at a darker truth. The well was not just a portal. It was a prison for something ancient and unspeakable, something that had been sealed away long before this house had ever been built. But now the creature was awake, and it was hungry. She needed answers and fast. Leaving Lily in the kitchen with a cup of hot chocolate to calm her nerves, Evelyn made her way back to the attic. The place still reeked of burnt wood and ozone from the shattered mirror, but she couldn't shake the feeling that there was something she had missed. If there was a way to end this curse once and for all, it had to be hidden somewhere in the remnants of Amos Thorne's possessions. As she sifted through the piles of dusty old books and crumbling papers, she came across an old, locked wooden box that she hadn't noticed before. Its surface was engraved with strange symbols that glowed faintly in the dim light. With shaking hands, she forced the box open. Inside, she found a stack of letters, their edges frayed with age. The top letter was addressed to Amos Thorne from a man named Father Samuel Whitaker, dated nearly 150 years ago. Amos, the well you have discovered is not merely cursed. It is a gateway to something far darker, a creature bound within, a creature that craves the souls of the living to sustain itself. The rituals you attempted can only delay its hunger. To truly end it, you must find its source deep within the well. But be warned, the creature can mimic those you love. It will use their voices, their faces, their memories to lure you into its grasp. You must not trust it. Evelyn's heart pounded in her chest. The well was not just a portal, it was a gateway to whatever horrific entity lay beneath. And if Father Whitaker's letter was to be believed, the only way to truly end this nightmare was to face the creature itself in the depths below. A cold resolve settled over her. She would not let this thing take Lily. She would do what Amos Thorne could not. She would descend into the well and confront whatever dark force had claimed her husband and now sought her daughter. Gathering what supplies she could find, flashlights, rope, and a small hunting knife she had found in the basement, Evelyn returned to the kitchen where Lily waited. The little girl's eyes were wide with fear as she watched her mother strap the knife to her belt. "Mommy," Evelyn knelt down, taking Lily's small hands in her own. "Sweetheart, I need you to be brave for me, okay? I have to go back to the well." Lily's face went pale. "No, Mommy, please don't go. He's waiting for you down there. He said if you go, you'll never come back." Evelyn's heart broke at the fear in her daughter's eyes, but she couldn't let that stop her. "I have to, Lily," she said softly. "If I don't, he'll keep coming for us. I need to end this once and for all." Tears welled up in Lily's eyes, but she nodded, her grip on Mr. Floppy tightening. "Promise me you'll come back," she whispered. "I promise," Evelyn said, even though she wasn't sure if it was a promise she could keep. The walk to the well felt like a journey into the heart of darkness. The early morning sun was barely visible through the thick fog that clung to the ground like a shroud. The clearing was deathly silent, the only sound the crunch of dead leaves beneath her boots. As Evelyn approached the well, she could feel its malevolent energy pulsing in the air, like a heartbeat beneath the earth. The iron cover was gone, and the opening yawned before her, a black maw that seemed to draw in all the light around it. Taking a deep breath, she secured the rope to a nearby tree and lowered herself into the well. The descent was slow, the walls slick with moisture and covered in strange, glowing fungi that pulsed with an eerie light. The air was thick with the stench of decay, making her gag with every breath. The whispers began almost immediately. At first they were faint, like a distant conversation. But as she descended deeper, they grew louder, more insistent, echoing off the damp stone walls. "Evelyn, come to me." She recognized the voice. It was David's. "Don't listen," she muttered to herself, her grip on the rope tightening. "It's not real." But the voice continued, growing more desperate. "Evelyn, I'm down here. Please help me." Tears streamed down her face, but she kept going. She had to finish this. She had to face whatever was lurking in the darkness below. At the bottom of the well, the stone floor gave way to a cavern, its walls covered in ancient symbols that pulsed with a sickly green light. The air was thick and oppressive, each breath feeling like inhaling tar. In the center of the cavern was a pool of black water, its surface bubbling as if something were trying to claw its way up. As she approached, the water erupted, and the creature emerged. It was a grotesque amalgamation of twisted limbs and rotting flesh. its eyes glowing with a cold, unnatural light. But the worst part was the faces, hundreds of them, shifting across its surface, each one a distorted mimicry of someone it had consumed. "David," Evelyn whispered, seeing her husband's face emerge from the creature's grotesque mass. The creature grinned, its many mouths opening in unison. "Join me, Evelyn," it whispered in David's voice. "Let's be a family again, forever." Steeling herself, Evelyn pulled out the hunting knife. "You're not him," she hissed, "and I'm not leaving without my daughter." As the creature lunged toward her, Evelyn slashed at it with the knife, the blade glowing faintly as it made contact. The creature screamed, its many faces contorting in agony. The well shook violently, the cavern beginning to collapse. Evelyn knew she had one chance. She had to seal the gateway permanently. With a final desperate prayer, she plunged the knife into the heart of the creature. The cavern erupted in a blinding light, the screams of the creature echoing through the darkness. Evelyn's vision faded to black. When she awoke, she was lying on the ground outside the well. The air was still, the sun shining down on her face. She was alive, and standing above her, clutching Mr. Floppy, was Lily. "Mommy, you came back," Lily whispered, tears streaming down her cheeks. Evelyn pulled her da. The days after Evelyn's descent into the well were a blur of exhaustion and dread. She had saved Lily, at least for now, and the house was eerily quiet, almost as if it were holding its breath. The oppressive atmosphere that had weighed on every corner seemed to have lifted, but Evelyn couldn't shake the feeling that it was only a temporary reprieve. She had seen the creature's true form, heard its countless voices, and felt its hunger. Destroying the heart of the thing within the well had driven it back, but the darkness was not truly gone. It had retreated, waiting, watching, and Evelyn feared it was only a matter of time before it resurfaced. Lily clung to Evelyn constantly now, never letting her mother out of her sight. The trauma of what she had witnessed had left her quieter, more withdrawn, her once bright eyes now shadowed with fear. Every time Evelyn left a room, Lily would whisper, "Promise you'll come back, Mommy." Evelyn did her best to comfort her daughter, but she knew deep down that their nightmare was far from over. The well may have been sealed, but the house remained tainted by its influence. The air inside was still thick with a cloying sense of unease, as if the house itself resented being robbed of its prize. That feeling was confirmed one night, 2 weeks after her encounter in the well. Evelyn awoke in the middle of the night to a sound she had prayed she would never hear again, a soft, rhythmic dripping. It was the same sound that had haunted their first nights in the house, a slow and steady drip, drip, drip. Her heart clenched with dread as she realized it was coming from the hallway. She quietly slipped out of bed, careful not to wake Lily, who was sleeping beside her. The little girl had refused to sleep in her own room since the night David disappeared. Evelyn grabbed the flashlight she kept on her nightstand and stepped into the hallway. The dripping was louder here, more insistent. As she approached the source of the sound, she realized with horror that it was coming from the basement door. "No," she whispered to herself, "I sealed it, I ended it." But the house seemed to laugh at her, the walls creaking softly, as if mocking her desperation. The basement door was ajar, and black water seeped from the crack, pooling on the floor like an oil slick. The air was cold, the familiar stench of decay filling her nostrils. Gripping the flashlight tightly, Evelyn pushed the door open and descended into the darkness. The basement was exactly as she had left it, the remnants of her earlier rituals scattered across the cold stone floor. But now, the black water was back, spreading from the far corner where the sealed iron door still stood. The door that she had thought was forever locked. But something was different. This time, the door was not only leaking, it was pulsing, as if something behind it was struggling to break free. A low, guttural whisper filled the air, the same one that had haunted her nightmares. "Evelyn, you cannot run from me. You cannot escape what I am owed." Evelyn's knees buckled and she fell to the cold stone floor. "I sealed you," she whispered, her voice shaking. "I did everything. I gave you what you wanted. The whispers intensified, filling the room with a cacophony of overlapping voices. You thought you could cheat me? You thought a knife and a flame could end what has been bound for centuries? No, Evelyn. The well's hunger is eternal, and you have only delayed what is inevitable. Tears streamed down Evelyn's face. What do you want from me? She screamed, her voice raw with desperation. I gave you David. I gave you what you demanded. The whispers paused, and then a single voice, soft, almost gentle, filled the silence. It was David's voice. You gave me to the darkness, Evelyn, but it is not enough. The well must have a willing sacrifice, one who gives their soul freely. It cannot be taken, it must be offered. Evelyn's heart twisted painfully. David, if you're really in there, tell me how to end this. But the creature that wore David's voice only laughed, a hollow, mocking sound that sent chills down her spine. I told you, my love, the well demands one more soul willingly given, and only then will it release us. Evelyn's hands shook as she realized what it was asking. It wanted her. It wanted her to give herself freely, to walk into the darkness and join David, to sacrifice her life in exchange for Lily's safety. She gripped the edges of the grimoire she had brought with her, scanning its pages for something, anything that could offer another way. But the pages were covered in strange symbols that seemed to shift and blur as she read them, the words slipping from her grasp like water. The whispers continued, relentless. There is no other way, Evelyn. You know it as well as I do. The only way to break the curse is to offer yourself willingly, a mother's sacrifice for her child's freedom. It is the oldest bargain, the truest magic. Evelyn was trembling now, her mind racing. She thought of Lily's tear-streaked face, of her promise to protect her daughter at all costs. If she went into the well, it would all end. Lily would be free. The house, the darkness, the whispers, they would finally stop. But could she really trust the creature? Could she believe that sacrificing herself would truly free Lily from its grasp? Then she heard it. Lily's voice, faint and desperate, coming from behind the sealed door. Mommy, help me, please! Without another thought, Evelyn threw the grimoire aside and grabbed the iron handle. The door was hot to the touch, pulsing beneath her fingers as if it were alive. The black water surged around her feet, rising to her ankles as if trying to pull her into its depths. With a scream, she yanked the door open. What she saw on the other side was beyond anything she could have imagined. The cavern below the house had transformed into a grotesque, pulsating hellscape. The walls were covered in writhing tendrils of darkness that seemed to breathe, expanding and contracting like the lungs of some great beast. At the center of it all was the well, its mouth gaping wide, tendrils of black water reaching out like claws. And there, standing at the edge of the well, was Lily. Her daughter was standing perfectly still, her eyes wide and glassy, her lips moving silently as if in prayer. The black water was slowly creeping up her legs, pulling her toward the well. "Lily!" Evelyn screamed, rushing forward. But as she tried to reach her daughter, the tendrils of darkness wrapped around her legs, pulling her to the ground. A figure emerged from the shadows, David, or rather, the twisted mockery of what was once David. His eyes were pits of darkness, his mouth twisted into that grotesque grin. "It's time, Evelyn," the creature whispered, reaching out a hand. "Come willingly, and she will be free. Refuse, and she will take your place." Evelyn looked at Lily, who was staring at her with eyes filled with terror. "Mommy, don't let it take me," she whispered, her voice trembling. Evelyn's heart shattered. She knew what she had to do. Tears streaming down her face, she turned to the creature. "Take me," she said, her voice barely a whisper. "I offer myself willingly. Just let her go." The creature's smile widened, its many voices overlapping in a triumphant roar. The tendrils released Lily, who stumbled back, her eyes clearing. But Evelyn felt herself being pulled toward the well, the darkness wrapping around her like a lover's embrace. Lily screamed, "No, Mommy, don't go!" But it was too late. Evelyn gave one last look at her daughter, a soft smile on her lips. "I love you, Lily. Be brave." And with that, the darkness swallowed her whole, pulling her into the depths of the well. The last thing she heard was Lily's voice, crying out for her in the dark. The darkness was absolute. It swallowed Evelyn whole, wrapping her in its cold, suffocating embrace. As she was dragged deeper into the well, it felt as though the very air was being squeezed from her lungs. Her body was no longer her own. Her limbs refused to obey her commands, moving only where the black water wished to take her. The icy tendrils clung to her, pulling her downward, deeper into the abyss. She tried to scream, but the water filled her mouth, her throat, her lungs, choking her cries into silence. All she could hear was the relentless whispering voices overlapping, maddeningly close, yet impossible to understand. It was as if the souls of all those who had been taken by the well were speaking at once, their words jumbled, their cries blending into a cacophony of torment. Then, just as suddenly as it began, the downward pull stopped. Evelyn found herself in a cavern, far beneath the surface. The oppressive darkness gave way to a faint, sickly green light that emanated from the walls, casting eerie, flickering shadows. She fell to the cold stone floor, gasping for breath, the air thick with the stench of rot and decay. She could barely comprehend where she was. The cavern stretched on endlessly, filled with twisted columns of black stone that seemed to pulsate like living veins. The ground was slick with the same oily black water that had nearly drowned her. All around her, the walls seemed to breathe, expanding and contracting as if the entire space was alive. This is where it lives, she thought, the realization sending a jolt of terror through her. This is its domain. As Evelyn struggled to her feet, she heard it again, the voice that had lured her down here, the voice that had worn her husband's face. "Evelyn," it whispered, soft and mocking. "You came willingly. You truly thought you could save her. How noble, how foolish." The creature that had taken David's form emerged from the shadows, its figure shifting and changing like smoke caught in a breeze. Its eyes glowed a sickly yellow, its mouth twisted into a grotesque parody of a smile. But it was no longer content to pretend to be her husband. The facade had melted away, revealing its true form, a towering, nightmarish figure composed of countless writhing shadows, its body a mass of twisted limbs and gaping mouths. Evelyn stood her ground, her fists clenched at her sides. "I gave you what you wanted," she said, her voice raw with defiance. "I came willingly. Let Lily go." The creature's laughter filled the cavern, a sound that sent icy fingers of dread crawling down her spine. "Oh, Evelyn," it purred, "you think this ends with you? The well has tasted your bloodline now. It is bound to your family. It will never stop, unless I consume every last one of you." Her heart sank. She had hoped her sacrifice would be enough to end it all, to protect Lily. But it had been a cruel trick, a final act of deception to lure her into its lair. The creature began to circle her, its many eyes glowing in the darkness. "There is no escape for you, Evelyn, but perhaps you could join me. I could give you power. I could give you life beyond death, and together we could bring your daughter into our embrace." Evelyn's stomach churned. "Never," she spat, backing away. "I'll die before I let you take her." The creature's grin widened. "Oh, but you already have," it said with a mocking tone. "You are already dead, Evelyn, or rather, you are mine. You chose to sacrifice yourself, and now you will join the others." The cavern began to shift and pulse, the walls trembling as if the creature's rage was seeping into the very earth. Around her, the black water began to rise, creeping toward her feet. But this time it wasn't trying to drown her, it was reshaping itself, forming into grotesque figures. One by one, the figures took on familiar shapes. Evelyn's heart clenched as she recognized the faces of those who had been taken by the well over the centuries. Their eyes were hollow, their mouths twisted into screams that never ended. And then she saw him, David, standing among the damned. His eyes were wide with pain, his hands outstretched as if reaching for her. "Evelyn," he whispered, his voice filled with sorrow. "I tried to fight it, but it was too strong." Tears streamed down her face. "David, I'm so sorry," she sobbed. I thought I could save you." The creature laughed, its many voices overlapping in a grotesque harmony. "He is mine now, just as you are," it hissed. But I am not without mercy. I will allow you one last choice, Evelyn. Give me your daughter willingly, and I will let you and your husband remain together in the darkness, forever." "No," Evelyn screamed, her voice echoing through the cavern. "I will never let you have her. She is innocent." The shadows around her seemed to tighten, as if the creature was growing impatient. "Then you will watch her suffer," it growled. "You will see her dragged down, just like all the others. She will call for you, but you will be powerless to help her. And when she finally succumbs, her soul will feed me for centuries." Evelyn's mind raced. There had to be a way out, some way to turn the creature's own twisted rules against it. She remembered the grimoire, the ancient texts that spoke of the well's hunger, its need for willing sacrifices. It had tricked her into offering herself, but maybe, just maybe, she could use that same rule against it. Taking a deep breath, Evelyn steeled herself. "You said I came willingly," she said, her voice shaking but determined. "That was the bargain. But you're wrong, I didn't offer myself to you. I offered myself to break your hold." The creature paused, its many eyes narrowing. "What are you saying?" Evelyn's heart pounded as she continued. "You said the well requires a soul willingly given, right? Well, I didn't come here to join you. I came here to seal you away. My sacrifice was not to feed you, it was to bind you." The creature roared in fury, the ground shaking beneath her feet. "Lies!" it screamed, lunging toward her. But Evelyn had already pulled the knife from her belt, the one she had used to wound the creature before. "By my blood, I sever the bond," she cried, plunging the blade into her own hand. The black water erupted around her, hissing and writhing as the ground beneath her feet trembled. The cavern began to collapse, the shadows screaming in agony as the light from Evelyn's blood cut through the darkness like a beacon. The creature shrieked, its form unraveling, the faces it had stolen melting away. "Evelyn, no!" David's voice called out, but she couldn't stop now. She had to finish this. "I bind you to this place," she screamed, "forever. You will never take another soul." With a final, desperate thrust, she plunged the knife into the ground. The cavern exploded with light, the creature's screams fading into a distant echo as the world around her disintegrated into nothingness. When Evelyn opened her eyes again, she was lying on the cold ground outside the well. The sun was rising, casting a golden light over the clearing. The air was still. The oppressive darkness that had hung over the land finally lifted. She struggled to her feet, her vision blurred, her body weak. And then she heard it, a voice soft and filled with relief. "Mommy, you did it." Lily stood at the edge of the well, her face streaked with tears, but her eyes were clear and bright. Evelyn stumbled toward her, pulling her daughter into a tight embrace, sobbing with relief. "It's over, Lily," she whispered. "It's finally over." But as she looked back at the well, she couldn't shake the feeling that it was only sleeping, and that one day it would wake again. The morning sun cast a warm, golden glow over the landscape, the clearing bathed in the soft light of dawn. Evelyn stood at the edge of the well, staring into its now sealed depths. The once ominous black water had receded, leaving only a faint, acrid smell in the air. Lily clung to her side, her small fingers digging into her mother's arm, as if afraid that if she let go, Evelyn would disappear. "It's over, Lily," Evelyn whispered, her voice shaking with exhaustion. "We did it. It's finally over." Lily looked up at her, her eyes wide and filled with the kind of innocence Evelyn had thought they'd lost forever. "The voices? They're gone?" Evelyn forced a smile, stroking her daughter's hair. "Yes, sweetie, they're gone. You don't have to be afraid anymore." But even as she said the words, Evelyn felt a lingering sense of dread gnawing at her heart. She had done everything she could, faced the darkness, sacrificed herself, and fought against the ancient entity that had claimed David. But the memories of the cavern, the whispers, and the creature that had worn her husband's face refused to fade. She couldn't shake the feeling that the well had simply gone dormant, that it was biding its time. Back in the house, the air was different, lighter. The oppressive weight that had made it hard to breathe was gone, and the constant feeling of being watched had dissipated. The house was quiet, almost peaceful. The black water stains that had seeped from the walls were gone, leaving only faint traces like scars. Evelyn and Lily worked together to clean up the mess left behind. They threw out broken furniture, cleaned the shattered glass, and swept the floors. For the first time in weeks, the house began to feel almost normal. But Evelyn couldn't bring herself to sleep in the master bedroom, where she had shared so many memories with David. Instead, she and Lily set up camp in the living room, blankets and pillows strewn across the floor. They curled up together, watching the fireplace crackle softly, trying to find comfort in the simple act of being close. As the fire burned low, Lily began to doze off, her head resting on her mother's lap. Evelyn gently stroked her hair, staring into the dying embers. For a moment, she allowed herself to hope that they could move on, that the nightmare was truly over. But then, just as she was beginning to drift off to sleep, she heard it. A whisper, "Evelyn, it's not over." Her eyes snapped open, and she sat up, heart pounding. But the room was silent except for the crackling of the fire and Lily's soft breathing. "It's just in your head," she told herself. "It's just the trauma playing tricks on you." Yet the whisper had been so clear, so close. It had sounded like David's voice, desperate and pleading. The next morning, Evelyn decided it was time to leave the house. She had clung to the hope that she could make it a home again, but now she knew better. The well, the darkness, it had tainted everything. She couldn't risk staying here any longer, not when Lily's safety was at stake. Packing was a hurried affair. Evelyn stuffed their belongings into bags with shaking hands, constantly looking over her shoulder as if expecting the shadows to reach out and grab her. Lily watched silently, her eyes filled with a mix of relief and fear. As they made their way to the car, the morning fog clung to the ground, swirling around their ankles like ghostly fingers. Evelyn hesitated for a moment, glancing back at the house. It stood there, dark and silent, like a slumbering beast. But then she turned away, determined to leave it behind. They drove away without looking back. The winding road that had once felt like a passage into darkness now felt like a path to freedom. But as they reached the outskirts of town, Evelyn noticed something in the rearview mirror, just a fleeting glimpse of a shadowy figure standing at the edge of the woods, watching them leave. She shook her head, refusing to give in to the paranoia. "It's over," she told herself. "We're free." The days turned into weeks, and slowly, life began to resemble something close to normalcy. Evelyn found a small apartment in a town far from the house, where no one had ever heard of the cursed well or the Thorne family's dark history. She enrolled Lily in a new school, hoping the change of scenery would help her daughter forget the horrors they had faced. But even in their new home, Evelyn couldn't escape the lingering sense of dread. Every time she turned off the lights at night, she would hear faint creaks, soft whispers, the drip of water echoing somewhere in the distance. Lily, too, had grown quieter, more withdrawn. She no longer talked about the voices, but she would wake up in the middle of the night, crying and clutching Mr. Floppy, insisting she had heard someone calling her name. "Mommy," Lily whispered one night as they lay in their shared bed, the moonlight filtering through the curtains. "Do you think Daddy is still down there?" Evelyn's throat tightened, but she forced herself to stay calm. "No, sweetie, he's gone. He's at peace now." But even as she said it, she couldn't forget the look on David's face in that dark cavern, the agony in his eyes as he reached for her, begging for release. One night, nearly a month after they had fled the house, Evelyn woke up to a soft sound, faint, almost imperceptible. At first she thought it was just a dream, but as she sat up, she realized it was real. A slow, rhythmic drip. Her heart froze. The sound was coming from the bathroom. Taking a deep breath, Evelyn grabbed the flashlight from her nightstand and made her way down the dark hallway. The apartment was quiet, but the sound of dripping water grew louder with each step, echoing off the walls. When she reached the bathroom door, she hesitated. She could feel the cold air seeping through the crack, a chill that sent shivers down her spine. Slowly, she pushed the door open. The sink faucet was dripping, dark water pooling in the porcelain bowl. The stench of decay hit her like a physical blow, making her gag. But that wasn't what made her scream. In the mirror above the sink, there was a message, scrawled in black, dripping letters. "You can't run forever." And beneath it, a single word, one that made her blood run cold. "Lily." The apartment lights flickered, and the whispering began anew, rising to a fever pitch. "The well is never satisfied. It will find you. It will find her." Tears streamed down Evelyn's face as she stumbled back, the whispers filling her mind, the shadows pressing in. The creature hadn't been defeated. It had only been delayed. And now, it was coming for them again. The well would never let them go. As she stood there, trembling in the dark, Evelyn realized the terrible truth. This nightmare was far from over. The whispers would never stop, because some doors once opened could never truly be closed. The end for now,